It is the early morning hours of December 31st, the year 1999, in the quiet border town of Del Rio, Texas. 10-year-old Crystal Searles wakes to an unimaginable nightmare, realizing she has sustained a catastrophic, life-threatening injury to her neck. Despite a severe loss of physical strength and the terrifying presence of an intruder still lingering in the room, she remains perfectly still. She forces her breathing into shallow, silent gasps, playing dead to survive the immediate threat. Once the house falls quiet, the young girl manages to pull herself upright, pressing her small hands tightly against her injury to stem the critical flow. Barefoot and deep in profound shock, the 10-year-old steps out into the freezing Texas winter night determined to live. She walks an agonizing quarter of a mile down a desolate dirt road in the pitch black until she reaches a neighbor's illuminated porch. She collapses against the wooden steps, setting off a chain of events that will soon expose one of the most elusive transient criminals in the history of the United States. Before the darkness descended on that winter night, the year 1999 offered a sense of boundless optimism for a bright, resilient 10-year-old girl from Kansas. Crystal Searles and her family traveled south to Del Rio, Texas, eager to spend the impending millennium holiday with close friends. Del Rio sat right against the southern border, a sun-baked expanse defined by endless stretches of scrub brush, wide gravel roads, and an expansive sky. The community thrived on a quiet neighborly trust. People left doors unlocked, and children rode bicycles down unpaved streets until the glow of sodium streetlights signaled a return home for dinner. The Harris family resided in a modest single-story home nestled within a sprawling mobile home park just off the main highway. The property featured a small yard, a gravel driveway, and a chain-link fence with peeling white paint separating it from the arid Texas landscape. Inside the rooms radiated warmth and holiday anticipation. 13-year-old Kaylin Harris and Crystal spent their days playing games, sharing stories, and preparing for the transition into the year 2000. The girls occupied a shared bedroom situated at the rear of the residence, separated from the master bedroom by a short hallway and a living area. The layout provided a false sense of security, creating a quiet space where the children could whisper late into the night. While the families prepared for the new year, a predator walked right among them, wearing the mundane mask of a struggling laborer. Tommy Lynn Sells drifted into Del Rio without drawing suspicion, presenting himself as a quiet transient seeking temporary work. He possessed an uncanny ability to blend into the background of working-class neighborhoods across the country. The Harris family, driven by a strong sense of charity, had befriended him at a local community church weeks prior. They welcomed him into their circle, unaware of the vast, hollow darkness he carried beneath his polite facade. Sells used his unassuming appearance as camouflage, manipulating the inherent trust of good-natured people. He possessed no permanent address, no registered vehicle, and no steady employment records. For over 2 decades, he had ridden the heavy freight rails, wandering without direction across the United States. He moved from town to town, finding temporary shelter in abandoned boxcars, cheap motels, and the spare rooms of sympathetic strangers. The heavy metallic clack of train wheels on iron tracks provided the only constant in his life. He navigated the vast American landscape as a ghost, leaving an untraceable path of profound tragedy in his wake. This total lack of a geographical anchor rendered him an invisible phantom to both federal and local law enforcement networks. During the 1980s and 1990s, communication between county sheriffs and state police often relied on slow, fragmented paper trails. Jurisdiction boundaries created rigid bureaucratic walls. A crime occurring in an isolated rural county remained trapped within those specific county lines, rarely crossing the desks of detectives 3 states over. Sells exploited this massive systemic vulnerability. He shifted his methods, altered his targets, and changed his routines, preventing criminal profilers from establishing a cohesive behavioral pattern. Authorities missed crucial red flags because his transient lifestyle kept him moving ahead of the slow churn of justice. Without a centralized national tracking database, the system allowed a dangerous drifter to slip through the cracks time and time again. Sells viewed himself as untouchable, fueled by an arrogant belief in his own superiority over the local authorities. He returned to the Harris home for friendly visits, committing the physical layout of the property to memory. He mentally mapped the distance from the front door to the rear bedrooms, calculating the exact placement of windows and exits. He sat at their table, smiled at their children, and finalized his grim intentions while hiding in plain sight. In the early morning hours of December 31st, the peaceful holiday atmosphere shattered. A heavy freezing silence settled over the gravel roads of the mobile home park. The families lay fast asleep inside the Harris residence. The adults occupied the primary bedroom near the front entrance, while 13-year-old Kaylin and 10-year-old Crystal slept soundly in the rear bedroom. Sells approached the property under the cover of a pitch-black, moonless night. He bypassed the main entrance, moving with calculated intent toward the back of the house. The distance from the gravel driveway to the rear window spanned only a few yards, but it marked the definitive boundary between safety and terror. He located a specific window he had observed during his previous visits. The thin glass and fragile aluminum frame offered zero resistance against a determined intruder. Sells pried the window open, slipping through the narrow opening with practiced silence. He stepped into the bedroom, his heavy boots making no sound on the carpeted floor. The deafening hum of the refrigerator in the nearby kitchen provided the only ambient noise in the dark house. The predator stood over the sleeping children, secure in his arrogant assumption that he controlled the situation. The sudden invasion escalated into a devastating and permanent nightmare. Sells launched a swift, calculated assault in the total darkness of the room. He targeted 13-year-old Callan first, ensuring she had no opportunity to raise an alarm or defend herself. The resulting confrontation brought a tragic immediate end to the young teenager, stealing her future in a matter of seconds. Sells then turned his attention to 10-year-old Crystal, determined to leave zero witnesses behind. He struck the younger girl, inflicting a severe, catastrophic laceration across her throat. The physical trauma proved immense, plunging the child into a state of critical shock. Believing his grim work complete, Sells turned his back on the victims. He did not check for signs of life, convinced that his violent methods guaranteed total silence. He climbed back out through the same rear window, disappearing into the freezing Texas night. He assumed he had maintained his untraceable ghost status, confident that the isolated community would wake to an unsolvable mystery. Inside the silent bedroom, a profound miracle of human endurance began to unfold. Crystal Searles, despite sustaining a fatal-level injury, refused to succumb to the darkness. She remained motionless on the mattress, listening intently until the faint crunch of gravel outside faded into nothingness. The 10-year-old understood the dire reality of her situation. She grasped the critical need to preserve her fading life force. She applied immense physical pressure to her neck, using her own hands to seal the devastating wound. Crystal swung her bare feet over the edge of the bed and stood upright, fighting off overwhelming waves of dizziness. She navigated the dark room, avoiding the tragic scene beside her, and stepped out into the hallway. The distance from the Harris home to the nearest neighbor spanned a quarter of a mile down a desolate dirt road. Crystal pushed open the heavy front door, meeting the biting winter wind. She placed one foot in front of the other, marching away from the nightmare. She focused her eyes on the distant faint glow of a neighbor's porch light. Her sheer will to survive transformed an ordinary 10-year-old girl into an unstoppable force for justice. She covered the massive distance step by step, ready to shatter the arrogant illusion of an untouchable phantom. Long before the flashing lights pierced the Del Rio night, law enforcement agencies across multiple states struggled against an immense, invisible tide of tragedy. Starting in the late 1970s, a highly fragmented trail of unsolved cases began multiplying along the massive American freight train network. Investigators faced an impossible forensic challenge because this specific predator constantly changed his weapons, his entry methods, and his victim profiles. One week he targeted an isolated farmhouse in the Midwest, and the next week he attacked a vulnerable transient near a rail yard in the Pacific Northwest. This erratic behavior completely prevented criminal profilers from establishing any cohesive behavioral pattern or geographical anchor. The vast railroad system provided a perfect moving sanctuary for a phantom who possessed no fixed address. He utilized the heavy iron corridors to vanish from local jurisdictions hours before detectives could even secure a crime scene. Communication between rural county sheriffs and state police relied on slow, cumbersome paper records sent through the Postal Service. Without instantaneous digital tracking or a centralized national database, isolated communities remained entirely unaware of the transient danger passing through their own backyards. A rigid bureaucratic wall separated each state, allowing the predator to slip away every time he crossed a county line. The sheer devastating cost of these systemic blind spots became glaringly apparent in November of the year 1987 in rural Jefferson County, Illinois. The Dardeen family resided in a modest mobile home situated near a desolate stretch of highway, surrounded by dense woods and isolated from neighboring properties. The spatial distance between their front door and the nearest neighbor spanned several hundred yards, creating a dangerous vacuum of isolation. On a freezing autumn evening, the predator stepped off a nearby freight train and walked down the gravel shoulder toward the quiet residence. Inside, a pregnant mother and her young son prepared for dinner, entirely oblivious to the dark figure approaching their property. The intruder forced his way inside the home, initiating a horrific sequence of events that brought a brutal, permanent end to the mother and her child. When the father returned home from work hours later, he too met a devastating fate at the hands of the waiting assailant. The transient attacker then walked back out into the freezing night, leaving behind an unfathomable tragedy. He hiked 2 miles back to the rail yard, climbed into an empty boxcar, and rode away into the darkness before dawn. The complete absence of forced entry marks and the lack of an obvious motive created a baffling puzzle for the local authorities who arrived the next day. The subsequent investigation into the Dardeen family tragedy immediately ran into a severe immovable dead end. Jefferson County detectives, trained to look for domestic motives, focused their entire investigative effort on local suspects and immediate family acquaintances. They operated under the rigid protocol that rural home invasions almost always involved perpetrators who possessed personal ties to the victims. This flawed assumption caused them to completely ignore the proximity of the interstate freight lines and the possibility of a transient drifter. In the year 1987, forensic science lacked a centralized national database to instantly compare genetic material found at a crime scene. Investigators collected physical evidence, but without a specific suspect to match it against the trace evidence sat useless inside cardboard boxes on a storage room shelf. A critical paperwork error occurred when local deputies failed to alert neighboring state jurisdictions about the specific nature of the home invasion. The rigid jurisdiction rules meant that the Illinois police did not share their findings with authorities in Missouri or Indiana, completely isolating the investigation. Because of this massive logistical failure, the perpetrator faced absolutely zero consequences for the destruction of an entire family. The system allowed a highly dangerous individual to continue riding the rails, fueled by an arrogant conviction that law enforcement remained too incompetent to ever catch him. The timeline shifts forward to the early morning hours of December 31st. The year 1999, returning to the desolate dirt road in Del Rio, Texas. 10-year-old Crystal Searles collapses onto her neighbor's wooden porch. her small hand still pressing desperately against her catastrophic neck injury. The homeowner opens the front door, makes a grim discovery, and instantly dials emergency services, setting off a frantic chain of events. Within minutes, the deafening wail of sirens shatters the quiet border town as an ambulance races down the gravel driveway. Paramedics rush the critically injured child into the back of the medical transport, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the glaring reflection of red emergency lights. The distance from the mobile home park to the local regional medical center spans several miles of winding highway. The emergency responders work frantically in the confined space of the moving ambulance, applying heavy gaze and direct physical pressure to stem the critical loss of vital fluids. They monitor her fading pulse, astounded by the sheer physical endurance of a child who just walked a quarter of a mile in freezing temperatures. The ambulance tires screech against the asphalt as they pull into the hospital emergency bay, where a team of trauma surgeons waits under the bright fluorescent lights. The medical staff immediately transfers the young survivor onto a gurney, rushing her through the swinging double doors toward the operating room. Inside the sterile confines of the surgical theater, a specialized trauma team initiates emergency life-saving procedures to stabilize the 10-year-old girl. The primary surgeon assesses the severe laceration, noting the terrifying proximity of the wound to her major arteries and vocal cords. The medical professionals work with meticulous precision, suturing the damaged tissue and restoring the structural integrity of her airway. To ensure she can breathe during the extensive recovery process, the surgeon carefully inserts a specialized medical tube directly into her windpipe. This necessary intervention completely prevents air from passing over her vocal cords, rendering Krista entirely unable to speak or vocalize her intense pain. The surgical staff monitors her vital signs on illuminated screens, marveling at the sheer resilience radiating from the small patient on the operating table. The physical trauma alone should have claimed her life before she ever reached the neighbor's porch. Yet she continues to fight against the fading darkness. Following the successful operation, nurses transfer her to a quiet room within the intensive care unit, surrounded by the constant, rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors. The heavy toll of the anesthesia forces her into a deep, necessary sleep while the Texas morning sun begins to rise over the scrub brush outside the hospital window. The medical team stations a permanent guard outside her door, ensuring the safety of the only living witness to a horrific nightmare. Simultaneously, local Texas law enforcement descends upon the Harris family residence, transforming the quiet neighborhood into a highly active restricted crime scene. Detectives map the spatial geography of the property, measuring the exact distance from the front gravel driveway to the rear bedroom window. Crime scene technicians wearing protective suits document the aluminum window frame, carefully dusting the thin glass for latent fingerprints or trace evidence left by the intruder. Inside the dark bedroom, investigators encounter the devastating reality of 13-year-old Kaylin's permanent fate, a grim reminder of the predator's brutal efficiency. The lead detectives painstakingly photograph the room, noting the distinct lack of a struggle, which indicates a sudden, highly calculated ambush in the pitch black. They search the perimeter of the mobile home park, attempting to track footprints through the arid Texas dirt, but the frozen ground yields almost no useful impressions. The initial assessment paints a bleak picture for the Del Rio Police Department, raising the terrifying possibility that a skilled, untraceable phantom has struck their peaceful community. They recognize the hallmarks of a transient offender, a seasoned intruder who knows exactly how to navigate the shadows without leaving an obvious forensic signature. The local authorities brace themselves for a long, frustrating cold case, unaware that the key to breaking the massive investigative void currently rests in a hospital bed a few miles away. During the late morning hours of January 1st, the year 2000, Two lead detectives step quietly into the intensive care unit to check on their critical patient. They approach Crystal's hospital bed, expecting to find a deeply traumatized, unresponsive child heavily sedated by strong medical painkillers. Instead, the investigators find the resilient 10-year-old wide awake, her dark eyes tracking their every movement with sharp, unwavering focus. Because of the surgical tube protruding from her windpipe, she cannot produce a single sound to answer their gentle, probing questions. The detectives attempt to comfort her, assuming she possesses no memory of the chaotic, terrifying moments inside the dark bedroom. Crystal shatters their assumptions by lifting her small, bandaged hand and using deliberate, frantic gestures to capture their absolute attention. She points to her own eyes, then points a single finger directly toward the open door, making a clear, undeniable motion of recognition. The bewildered detectives lean in closer, suddenly realizing the young girl is trying to communicate a crucial piece of information about the attack. She taps her temple and signals emphatically that she saw the intruder's face clearly in the dim ambient light of the hallway. The lead investigator immediately reaches into his coat pocket, pulling out a standard spiral notebook and a black ink pen. Crystal grasps the heavy pen with trembling but determined fingers, resting the spiral notebook against her elevated hospital tray. She begins writing short, decisive sentences across the lined paper, detailing the exact chronological sequence of the violent home invasion. The detectives read over her shoulder, completely stunned by the sharp situational awareness and precise memory of the young survivor. She writes down the specific physical characteristics of the man who stood over her bed, noting his height, his build, and the distinct features of his face. She details the texture of his hair, the specific shape of his jawline, and the heavy clothing he wore to ward off the freezing winter wind. The investigators trade bewildered glances, recognizing that this 10-year-old child possesses the exact forensic missing link that law enforcement agencies have sought for over 20 years. Her meticulous written descriptions eliminate the initial theory of a random, masked intruder and point directly toward a highly specific individual. Crystal continues to write, refusing to let the physical pain of her catastrophic injury stop her from securing justice for her lost friend. The predator made a fatal, arrogant calculation when he turned his back on this brilliant girl, mistakenly believing a child could never pose a threat to his absolute anonymity. The detectives gently take the notebook from her hands, rushing out of the intensive care unit to summon a professional police sketch artist to the hospital room. Inside the secure intensive care unit, a professional police sketch artist takes a seat beside Crystal Searles. The spatial distance between the hospital bed and the drawing board spans only a few feet, creating an intimate space for a monumental task. The artist opens a large leather portfolio, extracting thick sheets of drawing paper and a set of charcoal pencils. Unable to speak through the surgical tube in her windpipe, the 10-year-old relies entirely on precise hand gestures and her spiral notebook. She watches the artist draw an initial facial outline, shaking her head and pointing a finger to correct the width of the jaw. The graphite scratches across the textured paper, rendering the deep-set eyes and the specific hairline of the nighttime intruder. Crystal guides every single stroke of the pencil, demonstrating an absolute, unshakable focus, despite her massive physical trauma. She taps the paper emphatically when the artist perfects the distinct curvature of the predator's nose. The final portrait emerges under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room, forming an astonishingly accurate representation of a human phantom. Law enforcement veterans stare at the finished drawing, stunned by the immaculate level of detail provided by a critically injured child. They immediately take possession of the completed sketch, rushing it to a local printing facility. The Del Rio Police Department understands they now hold the definitive key to ending a massive, invisible reign of terror. Within hours, investigators distribute the composite sketch across the entire border town of Del Rio, Flyers appear on the glass doors of local grocery stores, community bulletin boards, and the brick facades of neighborhood churches. The tight-knit community studies the printed face, matching the sharp features against their own memories of transient laborers passing through town. The distance between the local community church and the mobile home park shrinks as congregation members examine the startling image. Several residents immediately recognize the man staring back at them from the paper. They identify him as Tommy Lynn Sells, the quiet drifter who recently attended their holiday gatherings and shared meals at their tables. The Harris family themselves had welcomed this exact man into their circle, offering him charity and friendship. The terrifying realization washes over the community that a prolific predator used their own good nature as camouflage. The police department switchboard lights up with definitive tips, providing investigators with a name, a description, and a general location. Detectives cross-reference the name through their databases, confirming his transient status and his complete lack of a permanent address. They move with extreme urgency, knowing the suspect utilizes freight trains to vanish across state lines without a trace. The invisible phantom no longer controls the narrative, stripped of his anonymity by the sheer bravery of a 10-year-old girl. On January 2nd, the year 2000, heavily armed authorities locate the elusive suspect hiding at a nearby residence. The physical distance from the Harris family home to his temporary shelter spans less than 2 miles across the arid Texas landscape. Tactical teams surround the perimeter of the property, cutting off every possible escape route to the nearby rail yards. Detectives approach the front door, their weapons drawn and their commands piercing the freezing winter air. Tommy Lynn Sells steps out onto the porch, raising his hands in a sudden surrender. He offers absolutely zero physical resistance, abandoning his arrogant facade as steel handcuffs lock around his wrists. The heavy metallic click echoes across the yard, signaling the definitive end to a 20-year cross-country rampage. Investigators secure him in the back of a patrol cruiser, driving him directly to the county interrogation room. Inside the concrete walls of the holding facility, detectives place Crystal Searle's charcoal sketch flat on the metal table. Sells stares down at his own exact likeness, recognizing the impeccable accuracy of the drawing. The reality of his capture shaders his inflated ego. A predator who evaded highly trained criminal profilers for decades realizes his permanent downfall came from a child who simply refused to die. Following his placement in a high-security holding cell, the massive psychological dam inside the captive predator completely breaks. Sells initiates a long series of interviews with cold case investigators, casually confessing to over 70 separate fatal attacks across the United States. He speaks with a chilling detachment, detailing a vast geography of tragedy that stretches from the Pacific Northwest to the rural Midwest. Authorities refuse to take his incredible claims at face value, implementing a strict multi-state verification process over the next several years. Detectives require him to provide highly specific, undisclosed crime scene details that only the true perpetrator could possibly know. He accurately describes the exact layout of the Darden family mobile home in Jefferson County, Illinois. He details the specific absence of forced entry marks and the precise placement of the victims, solving a mystery that haunted rural authorities since the year 1987. Investigators meticulously cross-reference his statements with physical evidence retrieved from forgotten cardboard Nord storage boxes. The advancing technology of the early 2000s allows forensic experts to finally match his genetic profile to decades-old crime scenes. Through this rigorous step-by-step verification protocol, law enforcement definitively links him to at least 22 separate cases. The massive bureaucratic walls between state jurisdictions crumble, exposing the true magnitude of his transient reign. Later in the year 2000, the legal system brings Tommy Lynn Sells to a Texas courthouse to face justice for the events in Del Rio. The courtroom features heavy oak doors, tall wooden benches, and a wide central aisle separating the gallery from the judge's elevated platform. Prosecutors charge him with capital offenses for the tragic home invasion that lamed the life of 13-year-old Kaylin Harris. The prosecution anchors their entire legal strategy on the undeniable testimony of the sole survivor. Crystal Searles, having recovered her physical strength and her voice, takes the witness stand under the massive vaulted ceiling of the courtroom. She looks directly at the man who shattered her childhood, displaying an unbreakable resolve that captivates the entire jury. The young girl details the exact chronological sequence of the attack, matching her spoken words to the precise notes she wrote in her hospital bed. Her brave, unshakable testimony completely dismantles any attempt by the defense to introduce reasonable doubt. The jury deliberate for a remarkably short period, returning a definitive verdict of guilty on all counts. The presiding judge sentences Tommy Lynn Sells to the ultimate penalty, permanently removing him from the general public. The condemned man transfers to the maximum security death row unit, confined to a small steel and concrete cell for over a decade. During this lengthy incarceration, he continues to provide crucial information to visiting detectives, helping them close isolated cold cases nationwide. The long appeals process eventually reaches its absolute conclusion in the spring of the year 2014. On April 3rd, the year 2014, the state of Texas carries out the sentence at the state penitentiary in Huntsville. The spatial distance from his isolation cell to the execution chamber marks the final journey of his life. Authorities administer a lethal injection, bringing a quiet procedural end to a man who caused an immeasurable amount of suffering. Far removed from the grim walls of the Texas prison system, Crystal Searles grows into a remarkable adult. She refuses to let the darkest night of her life define her permanent identity or dictate her future. She channels her unimaginable childhood trauma into a lifelong mission, becoming a passionate advocate for survivors of violent crimes. Her incredible journey from a desolate dirt road to a powerful voice of justice stands as a testament to the absolute triumph of human resilience.